If we see any object about which we don't have any associated memory, later if we have to talk about object, we start describing object through characteristics. Similarly, in the API world, REST has defined guiding principles. If that is followed, API is called RESTful. Hi, my name is Sandeep. Welcome to Knowledge Exchange, and the topic of today's discussion is REST. So, REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and by the definition, a software style where client it describes how client and server should communicate and how request or responses travel over the web. Let's talk about the first fundamental principle, resource based and universal interface. So here REST has brought focus on treating our website implementations as resources. For example, if we are accessing a booking site and give the information like source, destination, on what date we want to travel and click on submit, we get the results of list of flights which are available. Flight is a resource in that particular case. Now, what is representation? So, let's say flight data is stored into the database, which is a resource. From the API perspective, API has to send the response back to the programmer, which a programmer or the web client can understand. And generally, the response is sent into the HTML format, JSON format, XML format, and so on. So that is the representation of the resource. It can be a complete information or it can be a subset of information. In representation, it also contains the metadata about the data. For example, in case of flight, it has the flight unique ID, which basically helps client to send the edited data back along with the ID, and server can update on the basis of that ID. And there can be additional metadata information as well. Second is the universal interface. So now for the client to access a resource, there has to be a well-defined interface or the uniform interface through which it can reach to that particular resource. And second is the action. There has to be a very well-defined actions which can be taken on that resource. For example, if REST is implemented using HTTP protocol, which is the case in most of the cases, HTTP verbs like get, put, post and delete, they becomes the action, and the URI can be like slash flight slash 123, where 123 is the flight ID. So REST brings the foundation with resource based and universal interface implementation. Now second is stateless. In earlier world, we used to maintain the user session in the server side, but REST says that or mandates that there should not be a user session maintained in the server side. It has to be a stateless so that it is pure resource based transaction. Now in this case, the representation of state should be good enough where the required metadata is available, so that when it is sent back on the server with the edited information, API is able to make edits into the backend data store. Third is cacheability. So here we are not talking about the cacheability or the caching within the server side implementation. Here we are talking about the response. The response should be open for caching on the client side. Now caching strategy from the client perspective can be implicit, can be explicit, or can be negotiated. Now fourth and fifth is all about the architecture. Here we are talking about the web communication. So certainly there is a client, there is a server, and on the server side we may have further layered architecture. For example, client don't need to know whether the data from the server side is coming from the cache which is implemented on the server side, or is it coming from the actual database itself. So there is a client server architecture, there is a layered architecture as well. And the sixth one is code on demand. There is a case where when the client is expecting for the resource, in the resource representation there is an additional code which is returned as part of the response, and the code will be executed on the client side, and that's what the code on demand is. And this is optional. So frankly speaking, to implement REST APIs, to call it RESTful, it must be resource based, it must have a universal interface, it has to be stateless, and there has to be very well defined guidelines around the cacheability, and others goes on. Thank you so much. Have a good day.